In my practice and what I believe to be a real classroom is the exchange of knowledge. But if I'm not open enough to see where my students come from and what they bring and the understandings they have about things, I think it's just one-way transmission of knowledge, and that's been outdated for a long time. So we need to break that and have a real conversation.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Edvan Brito joins us to discuss what the Brazilian settlements called favelas can teach us about how language, race, and geography intersect.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's Media Development Manager. We are excited to have Edvan Brito in the studio today. Dr. Brito is assistant professor and director of the Portuguese program at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville.
He is on campus as part of our monthly LRC speaker series and gave a talk titled Using Social and Cultural Issues to Promote Language Learning and Cultural Awareness, Language Variation, Race, and Migration. We will extend our conversation about the intersection of all these topics on our podcast today. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Edvan.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're very excited that you are here, and this was such a compelling talk and such an interesting topic.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can start us off by giving us a little bit of background on you and the research you've been doing.
All right. So I was born in Brazil, and that's where I completed my undergraduate studies at the University of São Paulo. And in the meantime, I came to the U.S. as an exchange student in 2005, and that's why I applied for a master's program later. Mm-hmm. And so I came back in 2008 and completed a master's in mass communication and media studies at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And when I finished this master's, I actually started my career as a Portuguese instructor in the U.S., so almost 10 years ago. As I was working as a Portuguese instructor, I also started my PhD in linguistics at Georgetown University. And so in my PhD, I looked at language variation in Portuguese, or more specifically in Brazilian Portuguese, spoken in Rio de Janeiro. And I conducted interviews with residents of the neighborhood called City of God, which is mostly known because of a movie with the same name. Yep. And so I got to go there and talk to some people about language, about living there, and did some analysis, and that was the research. So I've been interested in actually this intersection between language, identity, and power, which in my view is just how language variation is connected with how people speak in every situation with different groups. And so my goal is to get closer to understanding how we speak informs the way we see ourselves and other people, and the power relationships in those interactions.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So in your talk, you also focused on these general social and cultural issues and how you can use those to promote language and culture learning. So can you briefly summarize for our listeners here exactly what are the implications or what are the connections for the language classroom when you think about these issues like language variation, identity, and power?
Mm-hmm. So the talk was, I think I did an illustration of how these issues, let's say language variation, race, and migration, could be used as subjects that you can use in the classroom to make students understand not only what is going on in their own country, in the United States, but also in relation to the cultures they are learning with their language learning. But that is, I would say, specific to Brazilian Portuguese. And my goal in the talk was to engage language instructors to look at their own target language countries and identify those topics they think would be maybe challenging or interesting to talk to, students about. And so in doing that, my idea was to help them go deeper in the teaching of culture, which usually we tend to stop in the practices and products of culture, and say what is more visual, concrete. And we tend to forget to talk about the perspectives that give some, I say, foundation to those things that we see and relate to different cultures.
Yeah.
And so even the standards, national standards for language learning came up with this idea of the 5 C's, and culture is one of the 5 C's. And inside culture, usually they would talk about the 3 P's, practices, products, and perspectives. In general, language classrooms would be would focus on products and practices, and not so much on perspectives.
Yeah.
And so my idea was to kind of give an example of how those conversations could go deeper than just show, for example, pictures of a favela in Rio de Janeiro. But I should and need to explain to students how those places are formed. Where do those people come from? What is the history behind those places? What are the social tensions that those places create in cities like Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo? And so I think it's just we need to expand a little bit the discussion about the things we talk about in the classroom.
Yeah. Is it difficult to adjust topics like that to different levels of proficiency? So can you do this in the first semester? And I mean, how would you would probably have to have discussions around that in English. Or at what point in a curriculum would you position discussions and topics like that?
I believe I cannot prevent my students from knowing or discussing those topics. Even if they are beginner students, they should be introduced, because there's a clear connection between the language they are learning and these facets of the culture they are also learning.
Sure.
And so even if they cannot formulate using, let's say, Portuguese, these deeper connections, they can do that using English. Because in the beginner stages, that is one of the solutions. But I can use their skills, let's say, to describe or to identify certain features in pictures, for example, or in a video. They don't need to necessarily discuss the social problems or philosophical problems connected to those pictures, but they can see and they can describe what they see. And so I can use that in beginner levels. And as they get better with their proficiency, then you can start to introduce other ways of discussing those topics. And so we could introduce some readings or longer videos.
Sure.
And so I guess the difficulty depends on the level. And so that's, I guess, the main answer to your question. We have always to take to consider where students are and where we want them to be. And so that's the main.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like that students are interested in such issues, right? And that they want to learn more and want to, hear from the expert from you who has done a lot of research on this.
Yes, yes. Yeah, but actually that is not the case for most foreign language teachers, especially those who grew up in the United States. They often think that they are not so knowledgeable about those more complex issues. And so I would tell them to not be discouraged because of the lack of knowledge, because that would be something that these instructors could explore with the students and not
True, yeah.
feel incapable of
Yeah.
talking about them because they don't know enough.
Yeah.
And there's never a place where we are sure we know 100% of anything. And so I think we shouldn't take that as the number one rule. You need to know what you're actually doing. So
exactly. Well, and I found too that oftentimes it makes the instructor appear more human if you can actually say, "Oh, I don't know, but let me find an answer, and we'll discuss this later."
yes,
Yeah.
yes, you are right. And we shouldn't give that image of the teacher as the person who knows everything.
Yep.
And in my practice and what I believe to be a real classroom is the exchange of knowledge. And so knowledge is created both by the things I bring as an instructor, but if I'm not open enough to see where my students come from and what they bring and the understandings they have about things, I think it's just one-way transmission of knowledge, and that's been outdated for a long time. So we need to break that and have a real conversation.
Yep. So I'm wondering too, given the current political climate in the United States, these themes and issues of race and migration and maybe even, language variation, how does this factor into your teaching? Do you draw close connections to, the current events in the United States? Do you tend to focus on current events just in Brazil?
I think my starting point is usually the community where we are at. And then, so we go from local to global. And I cannot understand cultural issues in Brazil if I'm not open to discuss them in the United States. And so first we can look close and see how issues of race or migration and even language variation are dealt with here in our communities. And then we can explore or make comparisons with how people in other places deal with them. So I think it's a starting point, and there is no way we can live in this day and age and not acknowledge the impact of globalization and language variation, race or ethnicity, migration, because these are hot topics.
Yeah.
And so even when you say you are teaching conjugations, sometimes those tensions appear. I remember one time when I was teaching colors, and my textbook has pictures of people from Brazil and from other communities where Portuguese is spoken. And often times I saw that students did not make any, question or did not notice some of the nuances of those pictures. And I always made sure that we had a conversation about colors because that is one of the main social issues we have in Brazil.
Sure.
Even though most people try to avoid those conversations and they are not fun, but we need to talk about them. And so as we talk about colors, and that's a beginner class, in fact, we start to understand how this society is organized and who are the social groups we are talking about and what are they, where are they in relation to each other. So I think any class can be a potential subject for
Sure.
for a cultural teaching.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it brings it back to the C's that you mentioned, right? The communities and the connections and the culture. So, yeah, that's great.
Just going back a little bit to my talk. So I talked about the issue of favelas in Brazil, and when I say favelas, I'm talking about what the Brazilian government calls subnormal agglomerates, which for anybody to understand is just an informal housing settlement. And so those are communities that usually are created in properties that are owned by somebody else, and people occupy them for any reasons.
Yeah.
And so some places are not even favelas for, let's say, if we look at government criteria. But my idea is that there is something else beyond these physical, geographical elements that people usually use to define favelas. And so, in my view, I think there is more to it. In fact, I think there are elements related to how people look, how they dress, how they speak, that helps the outsider understand or categorize that place as a favela. So, as an example, City of God historically is been known as a favela, but if you look at government criteria, is not defined as a favela. Only 13% of its territory would be categorized as favela.
That's interesting.
But if you Google favela or City of God, favela is probably one of the first words you're going to
Sure.
see. And so that is connected to the issue of representation and how we create realities that can affect people. And I'd say most of the people who live there actually don't agree with the images they saw on the movie. Not because the images or stories were not true. They were, because they are based on real facts. The thing was, it just one-sided. Because you show the violence, you show the poverty, but you don't show people who go to school. You don't show people who go to work every single day. The families that have to build their houses or community work. And so when people are presented only to those images, you reinforce the idea that favelas are just that. And so I guess my point of view is that we need to challenge those representations and present alternatives. And so by studying language variation, my goal was to kind of demystify language itself and say, yes, we have these different variants for this feature in Portuguese. There is no problem in speaking one or the other. And first we need to do that and break that idea of good and bad. And then embrace diversity as an important feature of language and of culture. And so I think that is something I wanted to add.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Actually, can you describe for our listeners exactly what's the nature of this language variation?
Oh, okay.
Like, where is the variation?
So in this case, it was just one feature. This is actually very well known by scholars who study Spanish and Portuguese or maybe other Romance languages. So I studied the post-vocalic S. Let's say an example would be the phrase as casas, so the houses, and you have two S's there. In most cases, this S would correspond to the S for plural in Portuguese. And so there is more to it than just saying it's an S. It could be less lexical, could be morphological. But the thing is, in Brazilian Portuguese, we have 4 variants for that feature. or S. And two of them would be considered standard. It's more the way if I say as casas, it's standard. So most people would understand and not have any idea about that. If I say as casas, and there is also standard, would show me that this person could be from maybe the coastal areas of Brazil.
Okay.
And if I say as casa, then I'm deleting the second S. And so that shows a little bit of not only the variation, but also something about the speaker. So maybe it's someone with low, not a lot of education,
Yeah.
maybe working class. And so there are some ideas indexed in the production of that
Sure.
variant. And the one I looked at was the aspiration, which does not work well with the example I gave, the as casas. So let's change to os gatos, the two cats or the cats. So os gatos. And then I made the S sound like an ha sound. So os gatos. And so that, even though it's not clear what judgments people would have about that one, I found that is interesting how it's present in communities or places where you have, let's say, these informal communities. And so when people use the aspirated S or delete the S, we are also marking where they're from, where they live, what kind of education they might have, or what social class they may belong to. And so that was the main study. But I could have looked at many other issues. And so I've been trying to focus on non-standard features of Brazilian Portuguese because those are usually not well studied.
Sure.
And so they tend to be overlooked in the research.
Yeah.
And so I want to kind of give voice to the people who usually are not present in the research that we have about Brazilian Portuguese.
Fascinating. Yeah, I can certainly think of similar examples in English and how different variations have different implications socially. And that's, well, thank you. So thank you. And I guess to wrap up then, do you have any final advice for instructors who are interested in introducing these themes in their own teaching?
Yes. I have a few pieces of advice. So especially for people who don't think they are well prepared to take discussions on these complex issues, I would tell them to start slow and maybe tackle just like one aspect of this issue, and then maybe building up to more complex elements later on. And so also something that is very important, if you don't like to talk about, let's say, race, then you shouldn't talk about race because it's uncomfortable for you. So follow your passions. So something that strikes your interest. And so that's something important to keep in mind, because imagine, I often do that when I'm preparing my classes. I usually go through what is, let's say, my plan. And when I see something that I personally don't like to do, I cross that out. So I don't make my students do that.
No, that's
So
fair.
the same
Absolutely.
thing goes with culture. So, and when I say I don't like, it doesn't mean that I don't like because it's bad culture. I have this idea that there's a good and a bad culture. Or it's just not, let's say, appropriate for me to have that conversation because I don't feel comfortable.
Sure.
But don't deprive your students from having those conversations just because you are uncomfortable. You can tell them to explore and maybe help them find elements to understand those topics. But don't just bring them to the classroom if you are maybe not, I don't know, I'm looking for the word. If you think that you just need to talk about them, but you actually not so knowledgeable about these topics.
Well, but I liked what you said earlier, that you can learn with your students, right?
Yes.
If there is a theme that students are interested in, and you are just not knowledgeable about, or you don't feel that you are the expert, that could be an interesting facet of the classroom to explore together with the students, and then maybe, consult somebody who is an expert in that area too.
Yeah, you just should educate yourself. And I guess more importantly, be open to explore things that you normally don't explore. Because that's where it's probably the things that we avoid are the things that create more tension.
Sure.
And so by avoiding, we are not solving the problem.
Yeah.
We are just postponing a solution maybe.
Yeah.
So being open is just an exercise to embrace difference and to embrace diversity.
Yep. Great. Well, Edvan, before we sign off, we'd like to ask you one more question. Can you please share with us your favorite word in a language that you speak, or that you have learned, that you are learning, that you want to learn? So what is your favorite word?
Okay. I have the word in Portuguese for lightning bug or firefly, which is vagalume.
I like that.
Growing up in Brazil, I don't think I ever remember seeing them. But now, because I live in the south of the United States, they are everywhere in the summer. And I always wait for that time in between day and night where they come out and just see the magic happen. It's amazing to look at them. But the word itself sounds very good in my ears. When I say vagalume, I don't know, there is something to it that's very special to me. And also the fact that English has at least 2 variants for the same word. So it's also interesting. Because I often ask people what they would call those bugs, and some of them would say firefly, and then lightning bug.
Nice. Wonderful. Well, listeners, there you have it. Your Brazilian Portuguese word of the day. Edvan, thank you so much for being on Speaking of Language with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here and to share these moments with you guys.
Oh, thank you. Next week, we have Candace Black joining our podcast. Candace is an associate in instructional services in the New York State Education Department's Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages.
We will discuss developments in the state government related to world language education, including the revisions to the New York State Standards for World Languages she has been working on.
Until then,
auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.